The 1%, Part 4. Landing structure for the displaced. MXDM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. April 9th, 2026. Part 4. The Transition Campus. 16. Landing structure for the displaced. When an aircraft loses its engine, the pilot does not stop flying. She flies differently. She flies without thrust, which means she flies without the assumption that she can correct any error by applying more power. Every decision becomes more consequential because the margin for error has compressed. The altitude she has is the only altitude she will have. The glide path she chooses is the path she commits to. And the question that now organizes everything, the question that displaces every other question about speed and heading and weather and fuel, is a single spatial question. Where do I land? Not, how do I restore the engine? The engine is gone and no act of will or competence restores it. Not, how do I avoid landing? Landing is now the only outcome. The only question that remains open, the only question that the remaining altitude and the remaining control authority can address, is where the landing occurs. On what surface? In what condition? With what chance of walking away from it into whatever comes next? The displaced worker is in this position. Not metaphorically in this position, structurally, functionally, with the same compression of margin and the same foreclosure of the option that organizing everything around engine restoration would provide. The engine, the employment that organized her daily life, her identity, her social connection, her temporal structure, her sense of purposeful contribution to something larger than herself, is gone. Not temporarily interrupted. Not available for restoration through sufficient retraining or sufficient willingness to accept a lower wage or sufficient geographical mobility toward the places where the old engine type is still running in residual pockets of the pre-transition economy. Gone in the structural sense. The category of activity that her employment represented is being dissolved by the same technological forces that are dissolving it everywhere, at a speed that outpaces any retraining curriculum and a completeness that leaves no adjacent sector available for the lateral migration that previous displacement waves made possible. The question that this condition produces is the pilot's question. Where do I land? Industrial civilization has never answered this question seriously. It has answered the engine restoration question through retraining programs, unemployment insurance, job placement services, skills development initiatives, and the full apparatus of the welfare state's response to displacement, with varying degrees of adequacy. It has answered the question of how to maintain altitude while the engine is being restored, through income support, food assistance, housing provision, and the other mechanisms of social protection that prevent the immediate material consequences of displacement from becoming fatal before the restoration has time to work. But it has not answered the landing question. Because the landing question assumes that the engine is not coming back, that the altitude is what it is, that the glide path must be chosen, that the surface must be found. Industrial civilization's response to displacement has been organized entirely around the assumption that the engine will come back, that the retraining will work, that the new sector will absorb, that the market will find a new use for the displaced capacity, and the displaced person will find her way back into the productive mainstream of the scarcity economy that organized everything before the disruption. This assumption has, in previous transitions, been sufficiently accurate to sustain the response it organized. The retraining worked, eventually. The new sector absorbed, eventually. The market found new uses for displaced capacity, eventually. The engine came back in a different form, producing different things, running on different fuel, but back. And the apparatus of the welfare state's displacement response, inadequate as it was in the interval, was adequate enough to sustain the displaced population through the interval until the engine returned. The current transition does not offer this eventually. Not because the economy will stop producing activity. It will produce enormous amounts of activity. Not because human competence will become worthless. It will remain valuable in forms and contexts that the current transition cannot yet fully specify. But because the specific form of engine return that previous displacement waves produced the absorption of the displaced middle into new middle category employment at comparable scale within a time frame that the welfare state's displacement infrastructure was designed to bridge is not available to the current wave in any configuration that the honest assessment of the transition structure supports. The engine is not coming back in the form that organized the world that produced the people who are now displaced from it. The landing question is the real question, and the landing question requires a landing structure. A landing structure is not a social safety net. The safety net catches the falling. It prevents the fall from becoming fatal, maintains the minimum conditions of material survival through the interval of transition, and holds the displaced person in suspension until the engine returns. The safety net is designed for the pilot who is going to restart the engine. It keeps her alive while she works on the restart. A landing structure is something different. It is designed for the pilot who is not going to restart the engine, who has made the realistic assessment that the engine is not available for restart, that the altitude is the altitude, and that the question is now exclusively about landing well. The landing structure provides the surface, the orientation, the guidance on approach, the infrastructure that transforms the inevitable landing from a crash into a transition, from an ending into a beginning of something that the pilot, having landed, can now inhabit. The distinction between a safety net and a landing structure is the distinction between a response designed for a temporary condition and a response designed for a permanent transition. The safety net assumes temporariness. It is designed to be removed when the engine returns, to be a bridge rather than a destination, to maintain the displaced person in a state of readiness for restoration. The landing structure assumes permanence, not the permanence of the displaced person's displacement, but the permanence of the transition itself. The recognition that the world she is landing in is not a temporary condition she is passing through on the way back to the world she left, but the actual world she is now in, the world that requires new orientation, new capabilities, new forms of purposeful engagement that the world she left did not provide and cannot now provide. The 1% campus is a landing structure. It is designed for the pilot who is landing, who has made, or who the transition is making for her regardless of her preferences, the assessment that the engine is not returning in the form that organized her previous life. It provides not the safety net that sustains her in suspension, but the surface that receives her arrival, the orientation that helps her understand where she has landed, and the infrastructure that makes what comes after the landing inhabitable. What does a landing structure require in the specific conditions of the post-displacement transition? It requires, first, a surface that holds. The surface that holds is the material and social provision that makes the campus inhabitable as a place of ongoing life rather than temporary refuge. Housing, food, physical security, healthcare, the baseline material conditions without which no higher-order function of the campus is accessible to the people who need it. The transition campus that provides governance innovation but not food, that offers dream validation but not shelter, that develops meaning infrastructure but not the material infrastructure that meaning requires to be experienced, is a campus designed for people whose material needs are already met, which is to say a campus not designed for the displaced. The 1% campus is explicitly not that campus. Its landing structure begins at the level of material provision, because the people it is designed to serve arrive in conditions of material precarity that precede and condition every other dimension of their transition. The pilot who lands hard needs triage before she needs orientation. The displaced worker who arrives at the campus without stable material footing cannot engage with the dream validation process, cannot participate in the weaving of collective futures, cannot exercise the governance rights that the campus's architecture provides, until the baseline conditions of her material life are sufficiently stable to free the cognitive and emotional capacity that governance participation requires. This is not a concession to the welfare state model. It is an architectural requirement of the landing structure model. The safety net is designed to be removed when no longer needed. The campus's material provision is designed to transition from the intensive support of the immediate post-displacement period through the graduated self-sufficiency that the campus's governance and economic architecture make possible as the displaced person's engagement with the campus deepens. The material provision is the first layer of the landing structure, not the whole of it and not the permanent condition it sustains. It requires, second, orientation without prescription. The pilot who has landed in unfamiliar terrain needs to know where she is before she can decide where to go. But knowing where she is does not mean being told where to go. The orientation that the landing structure provides is spatial and social and temporal. It tells the arriving person what kind of place this is, what kinds of activity are possible here, what the governance structures are through which those activities are organized, and what the relationship is between this campus and the broader transition that it is a part of. It does not tell her what her role is, what her dream should be, what the validation process will find worthy of support. That is her determination to make through her own engagement with the campus's processes. This distinction between orientation and prescription is the specific expression in the landing structure's design of the doctrine's founding respect for the autonomous agency of the displaced person. She is not arriving at a program that has determined what she needs and organized her experience to deliver it. She is arriving at a structure that has prepared the conditions within which she can determine what she needs and find the community support to pursue it. The orientation tells her about the conditions. The prescription tells her about herself. The landing structure provides the former and refuses the latter. The spatial expression of orientation without prescription is the design quality described in the previous chapter as productive ambiguity, the design of arrival spaces that communicate the campus's character and purpose without specifying the arriving person's role within it. The path that opens onto the campus's common ground without directing the arriving person toward a specific destination. The gathering spaces that are available without being assigned. The dream catcher visible from the arrival point as the governance object it is, legible as the center of something without being legible as a command to approach it immediately or in a specific way. Productive ambiguity is not design incompetence. It is the specific design intelligence of a space that respects the time it takes to land, the time between the moment of arrival and the moment of genuine engagement, during which the arriving person is processing the fact of where she is and what has brought her here, and during which the campus's primary responsibility is to hold that process with patience rather than fill it with programming. It requires, third, community before program. The most powerful resource the landing structure possesses is not its facilities, its governance architecture, or its AI infrastructure. It is the community of people who are already there, who have already landed, who have already begun the process of finding their orientation, who have already started to form the social bonds and the shared understandings and the collective knowledge about what this place is and what it makes possible that constitute the campus's actual live culture. The arriving person's most immediate need, after the material provisions of the surface that holds, is not information about the dream validation process. It is the experience of not being alone in the condition of displacement. The recognition that the condition she is in is shared, that the disorientation and the grief and the anger and the relief and the tentative curiosity that displacement produces are not her individual pathology, but the common experience of the community she has arrived in. This recognition cannot be delivered by orientation sessions or welcome packets or carefully designed arrival experiences, however thoughtfully those instruments are developed. It can only be produced by the genuine proximity of people in similar conditions, by the shared meal, the casual conversation, the encounter in the common space that reveals, without ceremony, that the person across the table has been through something recognizable. The landing structure's design priority for community before program means that the social infrastructure of the campus, the spaces and rhythms and occasions that enable genuine human encounter, takes precedence over the programmatic infrastructure of the campus, the organized activities, the structured governance processes, the development opportunities, in the experience of the arriving person. The program is available. The community is present. The sequencing of engagement begins with the community because the community is the condition that makes everything the program offers accessible. This priority has an architectural implication that the doctrine makes explicit The campus's common spaces, its dining spaces, its gardens, its informal gathering areas, its paths, are not transitional infrastructure that connects the arriving person to the program. They are the primary infrastructure of the landing structure. They are where the most important thing that happens on the campus happens. The formation of the community that makes the rest possible. It requires, fourth, time that is not empty. The displaced person arrives with time. This is, on the surface, a gift. The freedom from the temporal demands of employment, the sudden availability of hours that were previously fully committed to productive function. In practice, for most people in the first period of displacement, it is an experience close to the opposite of a gift. Unstructured time, in a civilization that has organized the meaning of time entirely around productive function, is not experienced as freedom. It is experienced as the absence of the structure that made time meaningful. The day without appointments is not a day of liberty. It is a day without the markers that told the previous day what it was for. The week without deadlines is not a week of creative potential. It is a week in which the question of what to do with the time, the question that employment answered automatically without requiring the person to ask it, must be answered deliberately, and the person who has never had to answer it deliberately does not know how. The landing structure must fill this time, not with program, which would simply substitute one form of external temporal structure for another, but with the kind of time that is not empty without being directed. Time that has shape without having prescription. Time that provides the experience of purposeful inhabitation without specifying the purpose. The campus's daily rhythms are the primary instrument for this. The shared meals that punctuate the day with social occasion. The common maintenance activities, the garden, the cleaning, the cooking, the repair, that give the campus's physical fabric a daily texture of care that anyone can contribute to without requiring prior qualification. The informal workshops and demonstrations that community members offer from their own competence. The competence they developed in the employment they have left, but which remains available as a contribution to the community that surrounds them. The governance activities of the dream validation process that give the community's time a collective direction without prescribing individual roles within it. These rhythms are not a program. They do not require attendance. They do not evaluate participation. They're simply there, the campus's daily life, available to anyone who arrives in the space where they're happening, offering the experience of purposeful collective time to the person who is learning for the first time in her adult life what time feels like when its purpose must be found rather than assigned. It requires, fifth, grief before construction. This is the dimension of the landing structure that is most frequently omitted from the design of transition spaces, because it is the dimension that is most uncomfortable to acknowledge and most resistant to the optimistic framing that transition narratives prefer. The displaced person has lost something, not merely a job, the full package of identity, structure, community, purpose, status, and legitimacy that employment provided, and that no single alternative provision can replace simultaneously. The loss is real. It deserves acknowledgement. It requires time, not indefinite time, not time that the landing structure is designed to prolong, but the time that genuine grief requires before genuine reconstruction becomes possible. The landing structure that skips directly to construction, to the dream validation process, to the development of new capacities, to the articulation of aspiration for the post-employment future, is a landing structure that is building on ground that has not yet been cleared. The person who has not yet acknowledged to herself and to a community that can receive the acknowledgement that the world she was in is gone and that she is now in a different world cannot engage authentically with the processes of building in the new world. She is still in the psychic territory that her daily activity is organized around in the old one. She is performing the motions of transition while inhabiting the grief of displacement. The campus holds grief not as a therapeutic program, the clinical intervention of trained facilitators guiding structured emotional processing, but as a social fact acknowledged in the design of its spaces and its rhythms and its culture. The spaces that allow for the conversation that begins with loss before it arrives at aspiration. The community members who have been there longer and who can speak from their own experience to the shape of the path from the arrival grief to the engagement that eventually follows it. The common culture that treats the acknowledgement of loss not as weakness or failure, but as the honest beginning of the landing. The recognition, made in the presence of a community that can receive it, that you have landed and that this is where you are now, and that from here, not from where you came, the next thing begins. The landing structure that provides this, that holds grief as a social fact rather than a clinical problem, that treats the time of acknowledged loss as a necessary stage of the landing rather than an obstacle to the program, is the landing structure that produces genuine engagement when the grief has moved through sufficiently to make room for it. Because grief does move through, not on schedule, not in the linear stages that the clinical literature describes, not at the same pace for everyone or in the same form across different backgrounds and different losses, but through into the space on the other side of it where the question of what comes next becomes, genuinely, an open question rather than a barely concealed repetition of the question of what was lost. And it is from that space, from the other side of a landing's grief, inside the community that held it, oriented without being prescribed, inhabiting time that is not empty, on a surface that holds, that the dream validation process becomes what it was designed to be. Not a program that the campus administers, not a governance architecture that the displaced person participates in because the alternative is empty time, but the genuine articulation of a genuine aspiration, the dream that is not the restoration of what was lost, but the first real reaching toward what might now, in this place, among these people, be possible. The landing structure is the infrastructure of that reaching. It is not the program that follows the landing. It is the landing itself, designed to be survivable, oriented toward the terrain that has been arrived in, held by a community that knows the terrain because it has already landed there. The pilot who glides in without thrust and lands intact does not stand up from the cockpit and immediately begin designing a new aircraft. She stands up. She assesses her condition. She looks at where she is. She finds the people who are already there. She accepts the help that is offered. She grieves the journey that ended. And then, when the immediate demands of the landing have been met and the condition of the new ground has been assessed and the community that inhabits it has made itself known, she begins to think about what flying looks like from here. That is the sequence the landing structure provides. Not faster, not more efficiently, not with the optimistic compression of the transition narrative that wants to move directly from disruption to inspiration because the interval between them is uncomfortable to inhabit. At the speed that landing actually takes, which is slower than the market wants, slower than the program designers prefer, slower than the transition narrative allows, and exactly as fast as it needs to be for the landing to produce what comes after it rather than simply what the program was designed to produce regardless of whether the person who arrived was ready to receive it. The campus holds the time. The community holds the person. The landing structure holds both. And when the time is right, not when the program says it is, not when the governance architecture requires it, not when the development economics that fund the campus would prefer it, the displaced person who has landed will raise her eyes from the ground she has arrived on and look toward the dream catcher at the campus's center. And she will have a dream. Not the dream she carried into displacement. Not the dream the program suggested she develop. Her own dream, arrived at through her own landing. Ready for the web. 17. Workers, not artists alone. The artist residency is one of the most elegant institutional forms that the scarcity era produced for the non-economic dimensions of human life. Its logic is simple and internally coherent. The artist requires time, space, and material support to produce the work that the market will not reliably fund, but that civilization requires. The residency provides time, space, and material support in exchange for the presence of the artist in a specific community for a specific period, during which the artist's work and the community's life are presumed to enrich each other. The artist gets the conditions that production requires. The community gets the cultural presence and the creative output that the artist production generates. The arrangement is clean, bounded, and comprehensible within the existing vocabulary of institutional support for the arts. The 1% campus is not an artist residency. This distinction is not a judgment against the artist residency as an institutional form. The artist residency solves a real problem with genuine elegance. It will continue to exist, continue to serve the specific population it was designed to serve, and continue to produce the cultural outputs that justify its existence throughout the transition and beyond it. But the 1% campus was not designed for artists. It was designed for the displaced. And the displaced, at the scale and in the specific character that the current transition is producing them, are not primarily artists. They are workers. Former workers, technically, people whose working lives have been disrupted or dissolved by the technological forces described in Part 1. But workers in their self-understanding, in their competences, in their relationship to purposeful activity, in the specific forms of skill and knowledge and social orientation that their working lives developed in them. They are accountants who no longer have accounts to manage. Logistics coordinators whose logistics networks have been automated. Paralegals whose research functions have been absorbed. Mid-level managers whose translation function between strategic apex and operational base has been made redundant. Customer service representatives whose customer service has been replaced. Teachers whose instructional function is being supplemented and in some domains superseded. Writers whose content production is being commoditized. Coders whose implementation work is being automated by the same tools their implementations were designed to support. These are not people who are waiting for a residency. They did not organize their working lives around the aspiration to have time and space to develop a creative practice that the market could not support. They organized their working lives around the competent execution of functions that the market valued highly enough to pay for. And they were good at those functions, and those functions are now being dissolved by forces that have nothing to do with the quality of their execution. The distinction matters for the design of the campus. The artist residency is designed around production, around the creation of works that the artist will complete and the community will receive. Its spatial organization privileges the studio, the workspace, the production environment. Its temporal organization privileges the extended period of uninterrupted creative development. Its social organization privileges the relative autonomy of the resident artist from the demands of community life, protecting the creative space that production requires from the social claims that proximity to community generates. These design priorities are appropriate for the specific population the artist residency serves. They are inappropriate for the displaced worker, whose relationship to purposeful activity is organized not around the solitary development of a creative practice, but around the competent contribution to a collective function. The displaced accountant does not primarily need a studio. She needs a role, a defined contribution to a collective activity that uses the competence she developed over 20 years of professional practice in a context that recognizes and values that competence, even though the specific form it took in her previous employment no longer exists. This distinction between the production center design of the artist residency and the role center design of the transition campus determines everything about the campus's spatial organization, its temporal rhythms, its social architecture, and its governance structure. The role-centered campus is organized around collective activity rather than individual production. The worker's competence was developed in the context of collective function. The organization, the team, the project, the institutional structure within which her specific skill contributed to an output that no individual could produce alone. This is not merely a biographical fact about how she acquired her competence. It is a psychological fact about how her competence is experienced as meaningful. The accountant who balances the books of a community organization is doing something that her competence makes possible and that the community requires. The accountant who develops a personal creative practice in the accounting of imaginary organizations is doing something that her competence makes possible and that no one requires. The difference between these two activities is not in the quality of the accounting. It is in the relationship of the accounting to a collective function that makes it meaningful in the specific way that the worker's psychology requires. The campus therefore organizes its activities around genuine collective functions, functions that the campus itself requires for its operation, and that the competences of its displaced population are well positioned to provide. The logistics coordinator who manages supply chains for a retail organization can manage the supply chains of the campus's material provisioning. The teacher whose instructional function is being superseded in the formal educational system can develop and deliver the learning programs that the campus's governance architecture requires its participants to access. The customer service representative whose telephone-based function has been automated can develop the human-centered welcome and orientation functions through which the campus receives its arriving population. The writer whose content production has been commoditized can develop the institutional communication and documentation functions through which the campus maintains its relationship to the broader 1% network. These are not make-work activities, manufactured functions created to give the displaced worker something to do that resembles her former employment without requiring the genuine contribution that genuine employment produces. They are real functions that the campus genuinely requires, performed by people whose genuine competence makes them genuinely capable of performing them, in a context that recognizes and values that competence, even though its institutional form has changed. This is the specific form of meaningful occupation that the transition campus provides to its worker population, not the simulation of employment, not the development of an alternative creative practice, not the suspension in the safety net until the engine returns, but the genuine exercise of genuine competence in the service of genuine collective function, in a context that does not require the specific institutional form of employment to recognize and value that contribution. The role-centered campus is organized around competence recognition rather than credential replacement. The artist residency does not primarily concern itself with the resident's credentials. It concerns itself with the resident's work, the current quality and direction of the creative practice that the residency is designed to support. The credential that produced the practice, whatever it was, is relevant only as context. The work is what matters. The displaced worker arrives at the transition campus with credentials that are no longer adequate proxies for her value in the labor market. The degree from university, whose curriculum did not anticipate the transition, the professional certification in a discipline whose core functions are being automated, the years of experience in an organizational form that is dissolving. But she also arrives with something the credential system never adequately measured: the accumulated practical wisdom of years of competent engagement with real problems in real organizations, the specific knowledge of how things actually work that only sustained practice produces, the social intelligence developed through years of navigating the human dimensions of institutional life. The campus recognizes this competence directly, not through the credential that once proxied for it, but through the demonstrated exercise of it in the campus's actual collective functions. The logistics coordinator who manages the campus's supply chain demonstrates her competence through the quality of her management. The teacher who develops the campus's learning programs demonstrates her competence through the quality of her programs. The credential is irrelevant. The competence is visible and valuable and recognized as such by the community that benefits from it. This direct competence recognition is one of the campus's most important gifts to the displaced worker population. The legitimacy crisis that displacement produces is, at its psychological core, a crisis of competence recognition, the experience of having genuine competence that the labor market no longer values in the form through which it was previously expressed. The campus that recognizes that competence directly in the context of genuine collective function provides the specific form of acknowledgement that the crisis requires, not the sympathy of the safety net, not the promise of the retraining program, but the direct, daily experience of being genuinely good at something that genuinely matters to the community one is part of. The role-centered campus is organized around contribution rather than consumption. The artist residency positions the resident as a producer and the community as a consumer. The resident produces work, the community receives it. This is an appropriate organization for the specific transaction that the residency is designed to facilitate. But it is not the appropriate organization for the transition campus, because the displaced worker's psychological relationship to purposeful activity requires contribution rather than consumption as its primary mode. The worker who has spent 20 years contributing to the productive function of an organization has developed, through that sustained contribution, a specific relationship to the experience of work, the experience of being needed, of making a difference to an outcome, of being the person whose specific competence the organization required and whose absence would have produced a different and inferior result. This experience of necessary contribution is not a luxury of the professional class. It is a fundamental human need. The need to be needed, to matter to an outcome, to be the agent of a change in the state of the world that would not have occurred without one specific engagement. The campus that positions the displaced worker as a consumer of its programs, as the recipient of the dream validation process, the beneficiary of the transition infrastructure, the person for whom the campus was built, denies the displaced worker the specific experience her psychology requires. She does not need to be served. She needs to serve, in the specific sense of contributing her genuine competence to a genuine collective function in a context that recognizes and values that contribution. The campus, therefore, does not distinguish between those who serve and those who are served. Everyone who arrives is both. The taxi driver who arrives in displacement brings with her the knowledge of the city's streets and rhythms and hidden geographies that 20 years of professional navigation developed. The campus does not wait for her to complete a program before it asks for that knowledge. It asks immediately, not as an imposition, but as a recognition, you know, things that we need. The campus's governance infrastructure, its mobility planning, its relationship to the surrounding community, these need what she knows. She contributes from day one, not because the campus has designed a role for her contribution, but because the campus's genuine collective functions genuinely need what she has to offer. This is the specific form of dignity that the transition campus provides. Not the dignity of being cared for, which is real but insufficient, but the dignity of being needed, the experience of genuine contribution to a genuine collective function that recognizes the genuine competence of the person contributing. The role-centered campus is organized around the full range of displaced competences rather than the specific competences of the creative class. The artist residency is designed for a specific population with a specific relationship to creative production. It is not designed for, and is not experienced as welcoming by, the person whose relationship to purposeful activity was organized around logistics or accounting or customer service or management or the 100 other forms of competent professional function that the transition is displacing. The transition campus is designed for all of them, not by pretending that their competences are all equally applicable to every campus function, whether the transition from professional employment to campus participation is equally straightforward for everyone regardless of their background, but by taking seriously the full range of displaced competences as genuine resources that the campus genuinely needs, by designing the campus's collective functions to require the breadth of competence that the displaced population contains, rather than organizing those functions around the specific competences that an art-centered design would privilege. This is a more demanding design challenge than the artist residency sets for itself. The artist residency needs studios, time, and the social conditions that creative production requires. The transition campus needs studios and time and the social conditions that creative production requires, and also the supply chain management infrastructure that a community of hundreds requires, and the financial management systems that the campus's economic architecture requires, and the educational programs that the campus's governance architecture requires, and the communication and documentation systems that the campus's relationship to the 1% network requires, and the care infrastructure that the campus's arriving and vulnerable population requires, and the conflict mediation capacity that any community in conditions of genuine transition generates, and the technical maintenance systems that the campus's physical infrastructure requires. All of these functions are real. All of them require genuine competence. All of them are available in the displaced population that the campus is designed to serve. The campus that designs itself to need all of them, that organizes its collective life around the full breadth of its population's competences rather than the specific competences of one segment of it, is the campus that can provide the experience of genuine contribution to the full range of its population. This is what the 1% campus is, not a residency for a subset of the displaced, but a community for all of them. A community whose collective life is rich enough, diverse enough, and genuinely demanding enough of the full range of human competence to make every displaced person who arrives in it a genuine contributor from the first moment she identifies what she knows that the community needs. The role-centered campus produces its most important output in the relationship between the creative and the operational. The artist residency produces art. The 1% campus produces something harder to name and more important to the transition. The specific form of understanding that emerges when the person who knows how to imagine a different future and the person who knows how to make things actually work are in sustained proximity with each other and with a genuine collective project that requires both. The artist, the creative practitioner whose relationship to the world is organized around the production of new forms, is a vital presence in the campus, not as its primary population, but as one of its essential populations. The artist's contribution to the dream validation process is the contribution of someone whose competence is the imagining of alternatives, whose trained capacity is to see the world differently from how it is and to make that different seeing visible in a form that others can encounter. But the artist's imagining, without the operational competence of the displaced worker who knows how things actually work, produces aspirations that are genuine but ungrounded, that reach toward real possibilities without the practical knowledge of how those possibilities connect to the actual conditions of the campus's life. And the displaced worker's operational competence, without the artist's trained capacity for imagining alternatives, produces efficiency in the service of conditions that do not need to be more efficient, competent execution of functions that the transition has already rendered obsolete. The productive encounter between the artist's imagining and the worker's knowing, the sustained proximity, in the specific context of a genuine collective project that requires both of the person who can envision the different and the person who can make things actually work, is the specific cultural production that the 1% campus generates. Not artworks, though artworks will be among its outputs. Not operational plans, though operational plans will be among its outputs. But the specific synthesis of imaginative ambition and practical knowledge that the post-scarcity transition requires its governance to embody. The capacity, which neither the artist nor the worker possesses alone, to imagine genuinely new collective futures and to understand, simultaneously, what it would actually take to realize them. This synthesis is not produced by putting artists and workers in the same building and waiting for it to emerge. It is produced by designing the campus's collective functions to genuinely require both, by creating the conditions in which the artist's input and the worker's input are both genuinely necessary to the campus's actual life, in which neither population can accomplish what the campus requires without the specific competence of the other, in which the sustained proximity of different competences in the service of a shared project produces, over time, the cross-competence understanding that makes genuine synthesis possible. This is the most important thing the 1% campus produces. Not the artworks that the dream validation process validates. Not the governance innovations that the campus's collective life generates. Not the transition models that the campus demonstrates for the network that will eventually replicate them. The most important thing the 1% campus produces is the people who have been through it, who have experienced in a sustained proximity of genuine collective life, what it is to contribute their specific competence to a project that required competences very different from theirs, and who have developed through that experience. The cross-competence understanding that the post-scarcity civilization will require of everyone who participates in its governance. The artist who has spent 2 years on a campus with taxi drivers and logistics coordinators and former middle managers understands something about how the world works that her previous isolation in the creative economy did not provide. The logistics coordinator who has spent 2 years on a campus with artists and architects and governance innovators understands something about how the world could be different that her previous isolation and operational function did not provide. Both of them, having been through the campus, are more capable of participating in the governance of the post-scarcity civilization than they were when they arrived. That is the campus's primary output, not the artworks, not the programs, not the governance innovations. The people, changed by the landing, deepened by the community, expanded by the proximity of different competences in the service of a shared project, ready for the world that is being built. Workers, artists, and everyone in between, all displaced, all landing, all arriving eventually at the dream catcher, all dreaming, finally, in each other's presence. 18. Cognitive equalization in practice. Theory travels faster than experience. The cognitive equalization described in the opening chapters of this doctrine, the dissolution of the information asymmetry that organized the cognitive hierarchy of industrial civilization, the arrival of AI tools that make sophisticated analysis and planning and argumentation available to everyone regardless of credential or background, is a theoretical proposition that the available evidence supports. The tools exist. The access is expanding. The differential is compressing. The argument is sound. But the argument is not the experience. The taxi driver who has been told that AI tools give her the cognitive capacity of a management consultant does not feel that capacity when she sits down with a device for the first time and confronts the interface of a system whose design assumes a relationship to technology that her working life did not develop. The former call center worker who has been told that the cognitive hierarchy is dissolving does not experience its dissolution when she enters a campus governance meeting in which the vocabulary, the procedural conventions, and the social expectations of participation have been developed by people whose educational backgrounds equip them specifically for exactly this kind of environment. The middle manager who has been told that AI amplification makes his planning capacity available to everyone does not feel that his planning capacity is being respected when the campus's dream validation process produces, in its early iterations, outcomes that reflect the preferences of the most vocally confident participants rather than the genuinely collective judgment that the process is designed to produce. Cognitive equalization in theory is a description of what the tools make possible. Cognitive equalization in practice is the design challenge of making what the tools make possible actually available to the full range of people who need it. These are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where the transition campus either earns its claim to be a genuine landing structure for the displaced or reveals itself to be a well-intentioned infrastructure that serves the already advantaged in the familiar pattern of every institution that has claimed universal access while delivering differentiated benefit. The 1% campus takes this gap seriously, not as a problem to be solved once and then set aside, but as a permanent design challenge, one that requires ongoing attention, ongoing assessment, and ongoing willingness to modify the campus's practices when those practices are producing outcomes that the theory does not endorse. What does cognitive equalization look like in practice at the level of the daily life of the transition campus? It looks like accessible interface design that does not assume prior familiarity with the conventions of institutional participation. Every institution that organizes collective life develops, over time, a set of conventions for participation, ways of speaking, ways of signaling engagement, ways of navigating the social protocols of the specific institutional form that its founding population brought from their previous institutional experience and that subsequent participants must learn explicitly or implicitly before their participation becomes fully effective. The university seminar has its conventions. The professional conference has its conventions. The community board meeting has its conventions. The design charrette has its conventions. These conventions are not neutral. They are the accumulated protocols of the educational and professional environments from which the founding population came, and they advantage people who come from similar environments and disadvantage people who come from different ones. The person who has attended 10 university seminars navigates the 11th seminar's conventions without conscious effort. The person who has never attended a university seminar must spend significant cognitive and social energy navigating the conventions themselves, energy that is therefore not available for the substantive contribution that the seminar was designed to elicit. The transition campus, if it develops its governance conventions in the image of the institutional forms that its most educationally advantaged participants bring from their previous experience, will replicate this dynamic regardless of the formal universality of its participation mechanisms. The dream validation process will be formally open to everyone. In practice, it will be most easily navigable by the people whose prior experience most closely resembles the conventions through which it is organized. Accessible interface design addresses this by treating the conventions of participation as design decisions rather than defaults, by asking of every procedural convention that the campus's governance develops, whether the convention serves the quality of participation or merely the comfort of those whose prior experience has equipped them for it. When a governance convention serves primarily the comfort of the already advantaged, it is redesigned, not to remove all convention. Convention is the shared understanding that makes collective action possible, and its absence is not accessibility, but chaos. But to replace conventions that have been inherited from educational and professional environments that the full campus population did not share with conventions that are genuinely learnable by everyone who arrives. This is a continuous process rather than a one-time design decision. The campus's conventions will drift toward the educational and professional norms of its most institutionally experienced participants unless the campus's governance explicitly monitors for this drift and intervenes when it occurs. The monitoring is a governance function assigned to a specific stewardship role within the dream validation process's operational structure, resourced through the campus's allocation mechanisms, and accountable to the community for the quality of its assessment. It looks like AI interface equity that ensures the cognitive tools available on the campus are genuinely accessible to the full range of the campus population. The AI systems that the transition campus deploys to amplify the cognitive capacity of its participants are not, in their default configurations, equally accessible to everyone. AI systems are designed by people whose relationship to technology, language, and institutional communication reflects specific educational and cultural backgrounds. Their interfaces assume levels of technical comfort, linguistic fluency in the dominant language of the interface, and familiarity with the conventions of digital interaction that are not uniformly distributed across the campus's displaced population. The former investment banker who arrives at the campus with 20 years of experience navigating sophisticated digital interfaces will extract more value from the campus's AI systems, in their default configurations, than the former agricultural worker who arrives with no prior experience of AI interaction. This differential is not a reflection of their respective cognitive capacities. It is a reflection of their respective prior exposure to the specific interfaces through which cognitive capacity is currently expressed digitally. AI interface equity is the design commitment to address this differential, not by assuming that the investment banker's prior exposure should be the standard against which the agricultural worker's access is measured, but by designing the campus's AI interface to meet the agricultural worker where she is and developing her relationship to the tools at the pace and in the form that her specific background makes accessible. In practice, this means multiple interface modes, voice, visual, gesture, and text, for the campus's AI systems, calibrated to different levels of prior technical experience and available in multiple languages without the loss of functionality that machine translation currently imposes on the languages that are less well represented in the training data of dominant AI systems. It means AI tutors specifically designed to develop the relationship between the novice user and the AI tools, not through instruction in the tool's conventions, but through the tool's adaptation to the user's existing conventions, meeting her at the point of her current comfort and extending that comfort gradually toward the fuller range of the tool's capability. It means that the assessment of AI interface equity is a permanent campus function. A continuous evaluation of whether the AI systems that the campus deploys are producing equivalent amplification of cognitive capacity across the full range of the campus population, or whether the amplification is differentially benefiting the population segments whose prior experience most closely matches the system's default assumptions. It looks like deliberation norms that make the quality of an argument more important than the confidence with which it is delivered. The cognitive hierarchy of industrial civilization was reproduced in its daily operation, not only through formal credential requirements and institutional gatekeeping, but through the social dynamics of deliberation, through the specific ways in which confidence, fluency, and assertiveness were rewarded in the environments where collective decisions were made. The person who spoke first, spoke loudest, spoke with the specific register of authority that educational and professional training develops, was advantaged in the governance of institutional life in ways that formal participation rules did not reflect and that individual participants frequently did not consciously intend. These dynamics are not exclusive to the institutions of the scarcity era. They emerge wherever people deliberate collectively, because they are rooted in the social psychology of human group behavior rather than in the specific design of any institutional form. The transition campus will not be immune to them by virtue of its commitment to cognitive equalization. It will generate them, unless its deliberation norms are explicitly designed to counteract them. The deliberation norms of the dream validation process are designed to counteract them at 4 specific points. The first is the sequencing of contribution. In the weaving stage of the validation process, contributions from participants who have not yet spoken are actively solicited before the contributions of participants who have already spoken are extended. The person who has been silent, whether from uncertainty, from unfamiliarity with the conventions of deliberation, from the processing time that a second language requires, or from a simple fact that her contribution requires more setup than the flowing contributions of the most practiced deliberators, is given specific explicit space before the conversation continues without her. This norm does not suppress the contributions of the most practiced deliberators. It creates the sequential space in which the contributions of the least practiced are genuinely available to the deliberation before the direction of the conversation has been set by those who are most comfortable setting it. The second is the separation of idea quality from presentation quality. The weaving stage is facilitated by campus community members whose specific training is the separation of these 2 dimensions. The development of the skill to hear the genuine aspiration behind an inarticulate or tentative or grammatically complex articulation, and to surface that aspiration for the community's engagement in a form that does not require the community to perform the same separating work. The AI translation function described in the previous chapter supports this facilitation. But the human facilitation is primary because the separation of idea quality from presentation quality is a social act whose legitimacy depends on it being performed by a member of the community rather than delegated to a system whose separation criteria may themselves reflect the biases of its training. The third is the normalization of uncertainty. The deliberation norms of professional and academic environments reward the performance of certainty, the confident assertion of a position, the fluent dismissal of alternatives, the display of comprehensive knowledge that leaves no visible gap. These norms penalize the expression of uncertainty, the acknowledgement of what one does not know, the tentative proposal that is genuine in its aspiration but honest about its incompleteness. The dream validation process explicitly inverts this norm. The submission of a dream that is genuine but incompletely developed is not a deficient submission that the process reluctantly accommodates. It is the model submission, the articulation of a genuine aspiration that the weaving process is specifically designed to develop toward completeness. Uncertainty is not the failure to have achieved certainty. It is the honest starting point of genuine inquiry. The deliberation norms of the campus communicate this inversion through facilitation practice, through the way community members respond to uncertain contributions, and through the explicit celebration of the submission that says, "I don't know exactly what I want, but I know it's something like this," as a more honest and more productive beginning than the submission that claimed a certainty it does not possess. The fourth is the protection of the considered position. The most socially vulnerable contribution in collective deliberation is the position that requires time to develop. The position that cannot be stated in the rapid rhythm of the most practiced deliberators, but that, given time and the assurance that the time will be respected, has genuine substance. The deliberation norms of the campus protect this position through the explicit allocation of response time. The guaranteed space between a contribution and the community's response, in which the contributor can complete her thought without the social pressure of a conversation that has already moved on. It looks like competence visibility systems that make the full range of the campus population's knowledge and experience legible to the community that needs it. One of the most persistent practical barriers to cognitive equalization in collective settings is the invisibility of distributed competence. The fact that the knowledge and experience that the campus's population contains is not uniformly self-disclosing. The investment banker knows how to make her financial expertise visible in governance contexts. She has spent 20 years in environments where financial expertise was the currency of authority and has developed, through that experience, the specific skills of expertise, signaling that make her knowledge available to the groups she works with. The taxi driver who has developed, through 20 years of navigating a city, an extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of the relationship between physical infrastructure, human movement, and social geography, does not know how to make this knowledge visible in governance contexts. She has never been in a governance context where this kind of knowledge was recognized as expertise rather than dismissed as merely practical. The campus's competence visibility system addresses this asymmetry by making the process of competence discovery an active function rather than a passive one. Not waiting for the taxi driver to find the language in which her navigational knowledge becomes recognizable as expertise in the campus's governance conversations, but actively seeking out that knowledge through the specific mechanisms of the campus's social architecture. The facilitated conversations in which the AI connection function's competence mapping is translated into human encounters. The community members whose specific stewardship role is the recognition and surfacing of competences that the campus's formal processes would otherwise overlook, the deliberate design of the dream validation process's weaving stage to make questions of local knowledge. Who here knows about this? Who has done something like this before? Routine rather than exceptional. This is cognitive equalization at the level of recognition rather than access. It is not enough to provide the tools that make everyone's cognitive capacity technically available. It is necessary to develop the social infrastructure that makes everyone's cognitive capacity genuinely recognized as valuable, that builds the campus's collective intelligence by actively drawing on the full range of the competences its population contains rather than defaulting to the competences whose prior institutional context has already equipped their holders to make them visible. It looks like failure norms that treat the attempt that does not succeed as a contribution to the campus's collective learning rather than an individual's deficit. Cognitive equalization is not a state that is achieved and then maintained. It is a capacity that is developed through practice, through the repeated experience of attempting something, sometimes failing, receiving the community's response to the attempt, and trying again with the specific understanding that the attempt and its result have produced. The person who is developing her cognitive capacity in a new domain requires the experience of attempting things she does not yet do well, in an environment that responds to those attempts in a way that develops rather than discourages the capacity being developed. The failure norms of industrial civilization's institutions were not, in general, development-oriented. They were selection-oriented, designed to identify the people who already had the capacity the institution required, not to develop the capacity in people who had not yet acquired it. The performance review, the quarterly target, the project deadline, these are instruments of selection, not development. They identify who is already good enough. They do not develop anyone toward good enough from a starting point of not yet. The campus's failure norms are explicitly development-oriented. Not because failure is celebrated. Failure has real costs, and the dream validation process's design takes those costs seriously, but because the attempt that does not succeed is the necessary precursor of the attempt that does. And the campus's collective intelligence depends on the full range of its population developing the capacity to attempt things rather than restricting the communities attempting to the subset of its population who arrived already equipped with the specific capacities that the campus's collective life requires. The development-oriented failure norm manifests in the specific way that the campus responds to a realized dream that does not produce what its validation promised. Not with the assignment of individual blame to the dream steward, the governance equivalent of the performance review, but with the collective inquiry into what the attempt revealed about the conditions that the campus had not previously understood and what those conditions suggest about the next attempt. The steward who shepherded a dream that did not achieve its intended realization is not penalized by having her subsequent submissions weighted less heavily in the filtering process. She is recognized as having produced, through her stewardship of an instructive failure, a specific form of collective knowledge that the campus's institutional memory will make available to every subsequent attempt in related territory. This is not soft governance. It is accurate governance, governance that reflects the actual conditions in which collective intelligence develops, which are conditions of iterative attempt rather than conditions of correct performance from the outset. It looks, finally, like the ongoing calibration of all of the above in response to the evidence that the campus's practices are producing about whether cognitive equalization is actually occurring. Theory says that cognitive equalization is possible given the right tools and the right design. Practice produces evidence about whether the right tools and the right design are actually delivering what the theory promises. The evidence is in the participation patterns who is submitting dreams, who is contributing to the weaving, who is exercising stewardship, who is developing the campus's governance in the directions that the collective should be determining. When these patterns reveal that certain segments of the campus population are consistently less represented in the governance process than their proportion of the population warrants, the evidence is telling the campus something about the gap between the theory of cognitive equalization and the practice of it in this specific community, with these specific people, through these specific institutional forms. The calibration function is the campus's response to that evidence, the continuous adjustment of its practices in the direction that the evidence indicates is needed, not the replacement of the theory, which the evidence supports at the level of possibility, but the modification of the practice, which the evidence regularly reveals to be falling short of the possibility in specific and addressable ways. Cognitive equalization in practice is a moving target. The campus that achieved it yesterday must achieve it again today, in the conditions that today presents, which are not the conditions that yesterday presented. The population changes. The community develops. The governance practices that were adequate to the equalization challenge of the campus's first year are inadequate to the equalization challenge of its third year, when the founding population's accumulated institutional familiarity has created new forms of advantage that new arrivals must navigate. The ongoing calibration function is not optional. It is the operational expression of the doctrine's founding commitment to genuine collective intelligence. The recognition that genuine collective intelligence is not a design achievement, but a governance practice, not a state to be reached, but a direction to be maintained, not the outcome of getting the design right once, but the product of getting the adjustment right continuously. Cognitive equalization in theory is the claim that the tools are available. Cognitive equalization in practice is the work of making the tools genuinely available to everyone who needs them. The work is never finished. The campus that understands this is the campus that is doing it. 19. The end of professional identity. There is a specific kind of grief that the literature of displacement consistently underestimates. It is not the grief of lost income, though the income loss is real and its consequences are immediate and physical. It is not the grief of lost routine, though the structural collapse of the day, without the scaffold of employment, is genuinely disorienting. It is not even the grief of lost community, though the social world of the workplace, however instrumental and however imperfect, was a world, and its loss is felt as the loss of a world. It It is the grief of lost self. The professional identity, the specific form of selfhood that industrial civilization developed for the people it needed to staff the middle of its cognitive pyramid, is one of the most complete and pervasive forms of self-construction that any civilization has ever produced. It is complete in the sense that it organizes not just the working hours, but the full texture of a life. The social circles, the residential choices, the consumption patterns, the aspirations for one's children, the vocabulary in which one narrates one's own existence to others and to oneself. It is pervasive in the sense that it reaches into the dimensions of selfhood that are supposedly independent of professional function. The weekends, the hobbies, the family life, the friendship patterns, and organizes them too, not by force, but by the gravitational pull of an identity so central to the person's self-understanding that everything else arranges itself around it. The accountant is an accountant on Saturday morning, not in the sense that she is doing accounting on Saturday morning, though she may be, but in the sense that the specific way she sees the world, processes information, makes judgments, relates to other people, and understands her own value has been shaped by 20 years of being an accountant so thoroughly that the professional identity and the personal identity have become, if not identical, so deeply entangled that neither can be cleanly distinguished from the other. When the employment that organized this identity dissolves, what dissolves with it is not merely the job. What dissolves is the primary structure through which the person understood who she was. This is the grief that the literature underestimates. Not because the literature does not acknowledge it. The psychological dimensions of job loss are extensively documented. The research on the relationship between occupational identity and psychological well-being is substantial. The clinical evidence of the depression and anxiety and loss of purpose that prolonged unemployment produces is unambiguous. But because the literature treats this grief as a symptom of the displacement rather than as a primary phenomenon that deserves to be addressed directly, as the central challenge of the transition rather than as one among several dimensions of a primarily economic problem. The transition campus is organized around the understanding that the end of professional identity is the primary challenge of the displaced workers' transition, that the economic dimensions of displacement, though real, are not the root of what makes the transition most difficult, and that addressing the economic dimensions without addressing the identity dimensions produces a person who is materially stabilized but existentially adrift. Existential drift is not a clinical problem. It is a civilizational one. When a civilization dissolves, at scale and at speed, the primary identity structure of a large fraction of its population, and offers no alternative structure of equivalent coherence and social recognition. The consequences are not primarily clinical. They are political. They are the specific form of social instability that produces the authoritarian consolidation, the scapegoating of convenient minorities, the retreat to simpler identity structures, nationalist, religious, tribal, that provide the coherence that dissolved professional identity no longer does. Not because the people who have lost their professional identity are bad or weak or susceptible to manipulation in ways that the professionally secure are not, but because the need for a coherent identity structure is fundamental, and the person who has lost her primary one will find another. And the alternatives that present themselves in conditions of legitimacy crisis and civilizational transition are not always the alternatives that a thoughtful civilization would choose to offer. The transition campus offers an alternative, not a replacement professional identity, not a new credential, a new job title, a new institutional affiliation that performs the same function as the one that was dissolved. The campus does not offer to restore what was lost in a new form. It offers something different in kind, the opportunity to construct, through sustained participation in a genuine collective project, a post-professional identity. An identity organized not around the specific function one performs in a specific institutional context, but around the quality of one's participation in the ongoing collective life of a community that is itself engaged in something genuinely important. The distinction between professional identity and post-professional identity is not the distinction between having an identity and not having one. It is the distinction between an identity whose coherence is provided by an external institution, the employer, the credential, the professional association, the organizational hierarchy, and an identity whose coherence is produced through the ongoing exercise of one's specific capacities in the service of a genuine collective project that one has chosen rather than been assigned to. This is a harder identity to construct and a more durable one. Harder to construct because it cannot be conferred. The professional identity was conferred by the employer who hired, the university that credentialed, the professional body that certified. The post-professional identity must be earned in the specific sense of being produced through the accumulated experience of genuine participation rather than through the performance of the requirements that an institution has specified for conferral. There is no credential for it. There is no hiring process that confirms it. There is no performance review that validates it. The campus community recognizes it, over time, through the evidence of the person's actual participation, through the dream she has submitted and stewarded, the weaving she has contributed to, the function she has performed, the specific competence she has made available to the community's genuine needs. The recognition accumulates slowly through the daily texture of community life and cannot be accelerated by the demonstrations of qualification that the professional world rewarded. More durable because it is not contingent on the continuation of the institutional form that conferred it. The professional identity is coextensive with the professional institution. When the institution dissolves, or when the person's relationship to the institution ends, the identity loses its primary support structure and must be reconstructed from whatever elements of it survive the dissolution. The post-professional identity is not coextensive with any institution. It is coextensive with the person's ongoing participation in the collective life that produced it, and the collective life of the 1% campus, designed for permanence rather than temporariness, provides the ongoing context that the post-professional identity requires to remain coherent. The transition campus supports the construction of post-professional identity through 5 specific practices that are embedded in the daily life of the campus rather than organized as explicit programs. The first practice is the deliberate dissolution of occupational categories as the primary grammar of self-introduction. Every social institution has a grammar of self-introduction, a conventional sequence in which the relevant dimensions of a person's identity are disclosed to new acquaintances. The professional world's grammar is well known. Name, organization, title, in that order, with the title and organization doing the primary work of communicating who the person is and why her presence in this specific context is appropriate. The campus's grammar of self-introduction is different, not as a deliberate governance decision, reflected in the facilitated conventions of the campus's social life, organized around former occupation. The question, "What do you do?" is not the campus's primary question because what the arriving person did is not what the campus needs to know. What the campus needs to know is what the arriving person is reaching toward, what she is curious about, what she has noticed that others have not, what she brought with her from the life she has left that the campus's collective life needs. The grammar of self-introduction that the campus develops through its social conventions, the specific questions that community members ask new arrivals, the specific dimensions of identity that the campus's facilitated encounters surface is the grammar of aspiration and competence rather than the grammar of credential and title. It asks, "What do you know?" rather than "What were you?" It asks, "What do you want to understand?" rather than "What did you manage?" It asks, "What have you noticed?" rather than "Where did you work?" This seems small. It is not small. The grammar of self-introduction is the grammar through which identity is performed in social contexts. And the identity that is performed repeatedly in the social context of daily life is the identity that becomes most real in the person's self-understanding. The campus that consistently asks the questions of aspiration and competence rather than the questions of credential and title is the campus that consistently invites its community members to perform the post-professional identity rather than the professional one. That makes the post-professional identity the identity that is most legible, most recognized, most socially real in the specific social world of the campus. The second practice is the gradual transfer of stewardship responsibilities that accumulate into a recognizable role. The professional identity was, at its core, a role, a defined set of responsibilities, relationships, and competences that organized the person's contribution to the collective function she was part of. The role gave her a place in the social world of the institution, a place that was hers, that others recognized as hers, that she could point to as the answer to the question of why she was here and what she was for. The campus provides roles through the stewardship mechanism of the dream validation process, not in a single conferral, not through a job posting, in an interview, and a contract that assigns the role from outside the person's participation in the campus's life, but through the gradual accumulation of stewardship responsibilities that the person has chosen, that the community has recognized as appropriate to her specific capacities, and that have grown over time into a recognizable contribution that the campus's collective life genuinely depends on. The taxi driver who arrived at the campus and immediately offered her knowledge of the surrounding urban geography in the service of the campus's mobility planning is, 3 months later, the person the campus's dream validation process consults on every dream that touches the campus's relationship to the city around it. She has not been given a title. She has not been assigned a role. She has accumulated a recognizable contribution through the exercise of her specific competence in the service of genuine collective need, and the campus community recognizes that contribution as hers, as a specific thing that this specific person does, that the campus would do less well without. That accumulation is the construction of a post-professional role, not the kind that an institution confers, but the kind that a community produces through the gradual recognition of genuine contribution. It does not replace the professional role she lost. It is different in kind, organized around different principles, sustained by a different form of institutional recognition. But it is a role. It gives her a place in the social world of the campus. It answers the question of why she is here and what she is for. The answer is different from the answer her professional identity provided. It is, in the specific conditions of the transition, more truthful, less contingent on the continuation of an institutional form that has already demonstrated its impermanence, more directly connected to the exercise of her actual capacities in the service of an actual community's actual needs. The third practice is the community acknowledgement of transition as a shared condition rather than an individual deficit. The professional identity's grip on the person's self-understanding is sustained, in part, by the social stigma that attaches to its loss. Industrial civilization's moral grammar, organized around productive contribution as the measure of human worth, treats the person without professional identity, the unemployed, the displaced, the between roles, as a person in a deficient state. Temporarily deficient if the displacement is expected to be short, more seriously deficient if it is expected to be long. Constitutively deficient if the person has come to accept that the professional identity is not returning in any form. The transition campus addresses this stigma not through the explicit assertion that displacement is not shameful. Explicit assertions against shame are among the least effective instruments of social change, but through the organization of the campus's social life around the shared experience of displacement as a collective condition rather than an individual one. When everyone in the space has been displaced, when a shared condition of the campus's community is not the exception but the rule, when no one is the professional and everyone is the former professional, the social comparison that produces shame does not have the same purchase. This is the specific social gift of the campus as a community rather than a program. A retraining program enrolls the displaced person in a context where her displacement is the reason she is there, marked and visible in the specific institutional form of the program's design, which exists to address a deficit condition. The campus enrolls her in a community where her displacement is the common condition, where the question is not how do we address your deficit, but what do we build together from where we all are. The shared condition does not eliminate the grief of individual loss. Each person's loss is her own, specific to her history and her relationship to the professional identity she has lost. The campus does not pretend otherwise. but it places that individual grief in a social context that prevents it from becoming the defining narrative of the person's self-understanding, that offers, alongside the grief, the alternative narrative of shared transition, shared community, shared project, and the shared construction of what comes after. The fourth practice is the active celebration of the competences that professional identity obscured. The professional identity, in its long exercise, did not only develop the competences that the profession required, it also suppressed, marginalized, or simply ignored the competences that the profession did not need, the dimensions of the person that existed before the professional formation and that continued to exist in attenuated form alongside it throughout the professional career. The accountant who loved music but pursued accounting because music did not pay is not, after 20 years of accounting, a person who no longer loves music. She is a person who has not had time for music, or has told herself she does not have time for music, or has organized a relationship between her professional self and her musical self in a way that kept the musical self subordinate to the professional self because the professional self was the one that the world recognized and valued. The displacement of the professional identity is, among other things, the sudden availability of the suppressed self, the reappearance of the capacities and interests and orientations that the professional formation required the person to subordinate, but could not require her to eliminate. This reappearance is frequently experienced in the early period of displacement as disorientation, as the unsettling presence of a self that has been waiting to be available and that the person does not know how to inhabit because she has not inhabited it in 20 years. The campus creates the conditions for the celebration and development of these suppressed competences, not by organizing them into programs, but by building into its daily life the spaces and occasions in which they naturally surface. The music that the accountant has not played in 20 years surfaces in the campus's common spaces, where musical instruments are present and available without instruction or performance expectation. The drawing that the logistics coordinator abandoned when she took the job that paid the bills surfaces in the campus's garden, where she finds herself sketching the plants she is learning to grow. The storytelling that the customer service representative developed through 20 years of navigating the human dimensions of her work surfaces in the campus's evening gatherings, where the telling of stories is a valued practice rather than a marginal one. These surfacings are not the construction of a new professional identity organized around the suppressed competence. The accountant who rediscovers her love of music on the campus is not being trained to be a musician. She is being offered the experience of herself as a person whose capacities exceed the professional formation that has defined her, whose self is wider than the role she occupied, whose identity can be organized around a richer range of activity than the specific function the employer needed. That experience is the beginning of the post-professional identity, the first recognition that the self is not coextensive with the professional role, that the dissolution of the role does not dissolve the self, that what remains after the professional formation is stripped away is not nothing, but a person with a full range of capacities and interests and orientations that the professional formation required to be subordinated and that the campus is now making available for expression. The fifth practice is the temporal organization of the campus around rhythms that are not derived from the productive calendar of employment. The professional identity was, among other things, a temporal identity, organized around the specific rhythms of the working day, the working week, the quarterly cycle, the annual performance review, the career arc from entry level to senior to retired. These temporal rhythms were not merely organizational conveniences. They were the structure through which the professional person experienced herself as progressing, as moving through time in a direction that could be narrated as development, accumulation, and eventual completion. The dissolution of these rhythms and displacement is experienced as temporal disorientation, the loss of the markers that told the person where she was in time and where she was going. Without the rhythms of the working day, Monday is not different from Saturday in the way that it needs to be different to be Monday. Without the quarterly cycle, there is no punctuation that gives the passage of time its professional meaning. Without the career arc, There is no direction to the passage of years that makes the years feel like progress rather than mere succession. The campus develops alternative temporal rhythms, not derived from the productive calendar of employment, not organized around quarterly outputs and annual reviews, but organized around the natural and social rhythms that employment required the person to subordinate. The agricultural rhythm of the campus's growing spaces, which marks time through the seasons of planting and growth and harvest that the working calendar consistently interrupted. The social rhythm of the campus's community life, which marks time through the recurring occasions of shared meals and governance, assemblies, and celebration of validated dreams that create the punctuation that time requires to be experienced as meaningful. These rhythms are not substitutes for the professional calendar. They are a different relationship to time, one that the professional formation required the person to suppress and that the campus makes available by organizing its daily life around rhythms that do not derive their authority from productive function. The person who has spent a year on the campus inhabiting these alternative rhythms has developed, through that inhabitation, a different relationship to the passage of time, one that does not require the professional calendar to be experienced as meaningful, that does not depend on quarterly outputs and annual reviews for the markers that tell her where she is in time and where she is going. She is, in this specific sense, less dependent on professional identity for the experience of temporal coherence than she was when she arrived. Not because she has been taught to be less dependent, the campus does not teach this, but because she has lived for a year in a social world organized around different temporal rhythms, and that living has produced, in the specific way that sustained experience produces understanding that instruction cannot replicate, the actual experience of what time feels like when its meaning does not depend on productive function. Together, these 5 practices, the dissolution of occupational grammar, the accumulation of stewardship roles, the shared condition, the celebration of suppressed competences, and the alternative temporal rhythms, constitute the campus's approach to the end of professional identity. Not the replacement of one professional identity with another. Not the therapeutic processing of the grief of its loss. Not the program that produces the credential that confers the new role, but the patient, daily, socially embedded construction of a different relationship to selfhood, one that is organized not around the specific function the person performs in the specific institutional context that defines the professional identity, but around the quality of the person's participation in a community that is engaged in something genuinely important and that recognizes that participation through the daily texture of shared life, rather than through the periodic conferral of institutional recognition. The end of professional identity is a loss. It deserves to be grieved. And when the grief has moved through, not been processed by a program, not been managed by a therapy, not been replaced by a new professional formation, but genuinely moved through in the presence of a community that held it, what remains is not the absence of identity. What remains is the person, wider than the role she occupied, more various than the function she performed, more capable than the credential she held, ready, finally, for the identity that the campus has been quietly building in her, through the daily practice of genuine participation in a genuine collective project, through the gradual accumulation of the community's recognition of her specific contribution, through the sustained experience of being needed not for the function she was trained to perform, but for the specific person she is. The post-professional identity is not a consolation for the professional one. It is what becomes possible when the professional one is no longer available to organize everything around itself. It is harder to build. It is more honestly human. It is what the transition requires. And the campus is where it begins. 20. Participation without employment. The oldest question that work answered was not economic. It was ontological. Why am I here? Not here in the cosmic sense. The question that philosophy and religion addressed across the full span of human civilization, the question of what human existence is for in relation to the forces and purposes that exceed it. But here in the immediate, daily, practical sense, why am I in this place at this time doing this specific thing with these specific people rather than somewhere else doing something else with someone else or no one. Employment answered this question automatically, without requiring the employed person to ask it. The alarm answered it. The commute answered it. The desk, the task, the deadline, the colleague who needed the report by Friday. These answered it continuously, without interval, filling the hours of the working day with the specific content of the specific function that the specific institution needed the specific person to perform. The question, why am I here, was preempted before it could be asked. The answer was always already given. The employed person did not need to generate a reason for her presence in the world on a Tuesday morning. The employer had already generated it, and she had already accepted it, and the acceptance was renewed each morning with the sound of the alarm that called her back to the function that organized her existence. This preemption was experienced for most of the history of industrial employment as a feature rather than a bug. The question, why am I here, is not a comfortable question. It is the question that, in the absence of a ready answer, produces the specific form of existential anxiety that industrial civilization was organized, in part, to prevent. The person who must generate her own answer to this question every morning, who must decide, from a full range of what is possible, what she is for today, carries a weight of self-determination that the employed person is relieved of by the simple fact of having somewhere to be. The relief is real. The preemption is not without cost. The cost is the question itself, the question that employment preempts but does not answer, that accumulates across decades of productive function, waiting for the interval in which it can no longer be preempted, and that arrives in the moment of displacement with the full force of its long deferral. Why am I here? Not why was I there? The employment is gone, and the function it organized is dissolved, and the question of its justification is moot. But here, now, in the condition of displacement, with the alarm no longer sounding, and the commute no longer necessary, and the desk no longer waiting, and the colleague no longer needing the report by Friday. Here, in the sudden silence of the preemptive machinery shut down, why am I here? The transition campus is the first institution in the history of industrial civilization that has been explicitly designed to receive this question rather than preempt it, not to answer it. The campus does not answer the question, why am I here, for the person who arrives carrying it. The campus does not have an answer. The answer is not available from outside the person who must eventually generate it. What the campus has is the structure within which the question can be genuinely asked, and the community within which the asking can be sustained through the time it takes to arrive at an answer that is the person's own rather than the institution's provision. This is the fundamental distinction between participation and employment as organizing principles of human activity. Employment provides the answer before the question is asked. It tells the person why she is here, because the institution needs her specific function performed, and it tells her how long she is here, until the employment ends. And it tells her what counts as having been here well, the performance metrics that the institution uses to assess her contribution to its function. The employed person does not need to determine her own presence in the world. The institution has determined it. Participation asks the question and holds the space for the answer to develop. It tells the person that she is here, that her presence in this community, in this space, in this collective project is real and recognized and valued. But it does not tell her why she is here in the sense of providing the answer to the ontological question. It offers, instead, the conditions within which the answer can be generated, the community whose recognition makes the answer socially real, the collective project that gives the answer a direction to point in, the governance structure that makes the answer consequential rather than merely personal, the physical space that makes the answer inhabitable rather than merely thinkable. The distinction sounds philosophical. Its practical consequences are architectural. An institution organized around employment as its primary ordering principle designs itself around the function it needs performed. It specifies the roles, the tasks, the outputs, the performance criteria, and the accountability mechanisms before any specific person enters the institution. The person is recruited to fill a pre-specified space in a pre-specified structure. Her presence is explained by the institution's needs, and her value is measured by the quality of her fit with the specification. An institution organized around participation as its primary ordering principle designs itself around the conditions that make genuine participation possible. It does not specify roles before people arrive. It develops roles through the encounter between what the people who arrive bring with them and what the institution's collective life genuinely needs. The person is not recruited to fill a space. She arrives, and the community discovers, through the sustained encounter of her specific capacities with the community's genuine needs, what her specific contribution will be. Her presence is not explained by a pre-existing specification. It is explained by the ongoing relationship between what she brings and what the community needs. This is a harder institution to design and a more honest one. Harder to design because the absence of pre-specified roles means that the institution cannot know in advance what it will look like when populated, cannot specify the org chart before the people arrive, cannot predict the distribution of functions that the community will develop through the encounter of its members with each other and with its collective project. The institution designed around participation must be comfortable with the incompleteness of its own specification, must design the conditions for participation without specifying the content of it, must trust that the encounter of genuine people with genuine collective need will produce genuine roles without predetermining what those roles will be. More honest because the pre-specified role, however carefully designed, is always a fiction about the person who will eventually fill it. A description of a function that the institution needs performed, mapped onto a human being whose actual capacities and interests and orientations may or may not align with the mapping in the ways the specification assumed. The employment relationship is organized, at its foundation, around this fiction. The pretense that the person in the role are aligned closely enough that the person's presence in the role is genuinely her own contribution rather than the institution's requirement dressed in the specific texture of her individual performance. The participation relationship does not require this fiction. It does not pretend that the community knew what the person's contribution would be before she arrived. It acknowledges that the contribution is discovered through the encounter, that the community's understanding of what it needs is developed through the experience of what the people who arrive bring with them, and that the person's understanding of what she can contribute is developed through the experience of what the community genuinely needs from her. This is a more truthful relationship between a person and the collective structure that organizes her activity. It is also a more demanding one. The employed person's question, "Why am I here?" is preempted. The participating person's question, "Why am I here?" is held open until the encounter with the community and the collective project produces an answer that is genuinely hers. The holding open is uncomfortable. It requires the tolerance of a period of genuine uncertainty, the period between arrival and the development of a genuine role, during which the person is present in the community but has not yet found a specific form of her participation, during which the question is genuinely open and the community is genuinely holding it rather than resolving it through the premature assignment of a function. The transition campus is designed to hold this period without filling it, to maintain the productive ambiguity of the open question through the time it takes for the genuine encounter between person and community to produce the genuine answer. This is what the campus's design of arrival spaces, its grammar of self-introduction, its community before program sequencing, its grief before construction norms are all organized around. The protection of the open period from the institutional pressure to close it before the genuine answer has had time to develop. The genuine answer, when it develops, is participation, not employment. Participation, the specific form of purposeful presence in a collective that the person has arrived at through the genuine encounter of her specific capacities with the community's genuine needs, that is hers in the sense that it was not pre-specified, that it was not assigned, that it emerged from the specific texture of who she is in relation to what the community genuinely needs, and that it therefore carries the specific authority of the genuinely chosen rather than the accepted necessity of the institutionally assigned. Participation without employment is not a lesser form of employment. It is a different form of purposeful human presence in the world, one that the history of industrial civilization has made marginal, has confined to the voluntary sector and the community organization and the religious institution and the informal networks of mutual aid that have always existed alongside the formal employment economy as the shadow infrastructure of the social life that employment could not fully provide. The 1% campus makes participation the primary organizing principle rather than the shadow one. Not because employment is over. Employment will continue in various forms through the full duration of the transition and beyond it. But because the specific population the campus is designed to serve, the people whose employment has been dissolved by the transition before the transition has produced the new forms of employment that will eventually absorb some of them, needs an organizing principle for its daily life that does not depend on the return of the employment that organized its previous life. Participation provides that organizing principle. But participation, as an organizing principle for the daily life of hundreds of people in sustained proximity, requires infrastructure that the informal networks of voluntary activity and mutual aid have never been resourced to provide. It requires the spatial infrastructure of the campus, the physical environment designed to support the encounters through which genuine roles develop. It requires the governance infrastructure of the dream validation process, the collective mechanism through which the community's genuine needs are identified and the community's genuine capacities are directed toward them. It requires the economic infrastructure of the 1% funding mechanism, the material substrate that makes participation the primary activity of the campus's life rather than the supplement to the employment that funds it. It requires, in short, the full architecture of the 1% doctrine. Participation without employment, at the scale the transition requires, is not possible without deliberate institutional design. It does not emerge spontaneously from the dissolution of employment. It requires the construction of the conditions that make it possible, the spatial, economic, governance, and social infrastructure that the campus provides. This is the fundamental claim of Part 4, arrived at through the preceding chapters. The transition from employment to participation as the organizing principle of human activity is not a natural process that the dissolution of employment automatically initiates. It is a designed transition, one that requires the deliberate construction of the infrastructure of participation before the infrastructure of employment has fully dissolved, and that without that construction produces not participation, but the specific pathologies of purposelessness that the undesigned transition historically generates. The campus is that construction. But there is a further dimension of participation without employment that the doctrine must address directly, because it is the dimension that the most common objections to the transition campus's model target most precisely. The objection is this: participation without employment is participation without accountability. The employed person is accountable to the employer, to the performance metric, to the employment contract, to the institutional hierarchy that has the authority to terminate the relationship if the performance does not meet the specification. This accountability, however imperfect, however captured by institutional interests that do not align with genuine performance, provides the external pressure that sustained productive contribution requires. Without it, participation becomes the performance of presence rather than the exercise of genuine contribution. The attendance at the campus without the delivery of the genuine engagement that the campus's collective life requires. This objection is serious. It names a real failure mode. Participation without accountability is not the same as participation. The campus that provides the conditions of participation without the governance mechanisms that make participation accountable to the community it is supposed to serve is a campus that will eventually produce the specific form of collective free riding. The presence without contribution, the consumption of the community's resources without the genuine exercise of the capacity that the community needs. That destroys the participation ethic from within. The dream validation process provides the accountability that the employment contract provided in a different form and through different mechanisms. The employment contract's accountability was external and hierarchical. The employer held the authority to assess performance and the power to terminate the relationship if performance was insufficient. The person was accountable to an authority outside herself, whose assessment of her contribution was the measure of its adequacy. The dream validation process's accountability is internal and communal. The person is accountable to the community that recognized her contribution through the stewardship covenant she made publicly. The commitment to the care of the dreams she volunteered as steward, made in the presence of the community and held by the community as a form of social obligation. The authority that assesses performance is not outside the person and above her in a hierarchy. It is the community she lives alongside, whose daily experience of her stewardship is the evidence on which the assessment is made, and whose recognition she requires for the post-professional identity she is constructing through her participation. The social accountability of the participation community is different from the contractual accountability of the employment relationship. It is less precise. It does not produce the performance metric, the quarterly review, the termination decision. It is more pervasive. It operates continuously through the daily texture of shared life, rather than periodically through the scheduled performance evaluation. It is more motivating for the specific form of contribution that participation requires, the genuine exercise of genuine capacity in the service of genuine collective need, because it operates through the recognition of the community rather than through the authority of the institution. And the recognition of the community is the specific form of acknowledgement that the post-professional identity is built from. The person who stops contributing genuinely to the campus community does not receive a termination notice. She receives something in the specific social conditions of a genuine community that is harder to ignore and more directly addressed to the identity she is constructing. The withdrawal of the community's recognition, the gradual disappearance of the stewardship responsibilities that the community's recognition had produced, the experience of her own presence in the community becoming less legible, less visible as a genuine contribution, as the participation she is performing becomes increasingly disconnected from the genuine exercise of her specific capacity. This is not a harsh mechanism. It is a true one, and its truth is what makes it effective as accountability. Not the threat of termination, but the reality of recognition's withdrawal. Not the fear of external judgment, but the experience of one's own participation becoming less real in the eyes of the community whose recognition makes participation real. The campus does not punish non-contribution. It simply does not pretend that non-contribution is contribution. The community that lives alongside the person who is present without contributing knows that she is present without contributing. The social reality of that knowledge, experienced daily in the small interactions that constitute community life, is the accountability that participation without employment requires. This is a gentler accountability than the employment contract provides. It is not without consequence. Its consequences are real in the specific currency that participation accountability operates in, the currency of social recognition, of communal visibility, of the post-professional identity that requires the community's ongoing acknowledgement to remain coherent. For the person who needs that identity, who has arrived at the campus in the displacement that dissolve her professional identity and who is constructing, through her participation in the campus's collective life, the post-professional identity that will organize her existence in the transition. The withdrawal of the community's recognition is a consequence of genuine weight. Weight sufficient to sustain the participation that the community requires. Weight sufficient to make the question, why am I here? Answerable not once, but continuously, through the ongoing exercise of genuine capacity in the service of genuine collective need, recognized daily by the community that her participation serves. Why am I here? Because the community needs what I know how to do. Because the dream I'm stewarding requires my ongoing care. Because the campus's collective life is genuinely different by virtue of my genuine presence in it. Because I have chosen this, not been assigned to it, not been hired for it, not been recruited to fill a pre-specified space in a pre-specified structure, but genuinely chosen it through the encounter of my specific self with this specific community's specific needs. Because the answer to the question is mine, generated through the participation that the campus made possible, held by the community that recognizes it, sustained by the ongoing exercise of the genuine contribution that earned the recognition. That is participation without employment, not the lesser version of what employment provided, not the consolation for its loss, not the waiting room for its eventual return. The different thing. The thing organized around the genuine question rather than its preemption. The thing that requires the question to be genuinely asked and genuinely answered before the organizing can begin. The thing that is harder to sustain and more worth sustaining. The thing that industrial civilization made marginal and that the transition is making necessary. The thing that begins for the people who are living through the transition in a specific place where the community is genuine and the collective project is real and the dream catcher at the center is waiting for what they will propose. The campus is that place. Participation is what happens there. Employment is what was lost. And what is being built, slowly, genuinely, in the daily texture of shared life organized around something worth building, is not its restoration. It is its succession.
The circus survives on reaction. It feeds on outrage, applause, ridicule, belief. It does not care what you think, only that you respond.
The Great Derangement Syndrome, a neurochemical epic for the terminally online, prophetically blind, and spiritually orphaned.
Slafford.
The Art of Peace. Tactics for the Unarmed and Unrolled. A field manual for those who weaponize stillness and decode conflict into clarity. Peace isn't surrender, it's system mastery. In an age where every algorithm trains us to react, peace becomes the final rebellion. This isn't a pacifist pamphlet, it's a field manual for the lucid, the unrolled, and the still awake. The Art of Peace reinterprets strategy as serenity, resistance as rhythm, and silence as a form of intelligence. We make peace with the same precision they make war. Pirate first. Share. Here's a poetic and philosophical table of contents for the Art of Peace, structured as a mirror to the art of war, yet derived from its bones, rewritten for a civilization learning to wield harmony with the same precision as conflict.
Bolivar, the bankster's liberator. A forbidden history of Simón Bolívar and the invention of modern servitude. MXDM,
The banker's liberator, the debt that called itself freedom. 2 centuries after his bones were dug up for the cameras, Bolívar still owes the world an explanation. Not for what he fought, but for who financed the fight. Behind every cry of liberty was a ledger. Behind every revolution, a banker counting bayonets as assets. And behind the marble hero they sold us, a man broken by Parisian debts, refitted by London credit, and embalmed in interest. The republics that rose in his name were plantations reborn as portfolios. The chains became contracts. The whip, an exchange rate. Freedom, our first and most seductive loan. They called him the liberator. History may yet remember him as the world's first collateralized saint. Hashtag pirate first, hashtag Bolivar, hashtag forbidden history, hashtag debt is empire, hashtag financial colonialism, hashtag the banker's liberator, hashtag history is ledger, hashtag post-empire chronicles, hashtag Parada Primera.
This is awakening. Change begins now.